Grim Batol is a returning dungeon for Season 1 of The War Within. The dungeon starts with a 36-minute timer, so as long as you complete the dungeon within that window, you will upgrade your key. The first two mobs you'll encounter in the dungeon are Twilight Brutes and Twilight Earthcallers. Brutes will cast Obsidian Stomp, spawning swirlies on the ground that deal massive physical damage, so be sure to move out of these. Tanks should also use the defensive for their Brutal Strike ability. This is a tank buster that deals moderate damage. The most important caster kick from Earthcallers is Mass Tremor. This deals massive party-wide damage and slows everybody by 30%, and any leftover kick should be used on their other cast Earthbolt, as this will target a random player and deal nature damage, which can be scary if casts overlap. Next, you'll face the Twilight Destroyer. If you're targeted with their Twilight Flame cast, be sure to use the defensive, as this leaves a nasty shadow dot on you. It will also create Twilight Embers under your feet that you should move out of, as these deal massive damage. Their more scary cast is Umbral Wind, which sends out a wave of shadow damage that hits anybody in its path. This will deal massive shadow damage and knock players back quite a distance, so the best thing to do for this ability is to line of sight it. If you cannot do this, just use a defensive and make sure you're not near any edges. The final mob we have to deal with before taking flight is a Twilight Overseer. Tanks will need to be wary of their ability Rive. This ability slashes at the tank and increases their physical damage taken by 20% for a short period. This effect also stacks, so be sure not to pull too many Overseers at once, and use your defensives accordingly. Overseers also have Reckless Tactic and Enrage Aura on any nearby mobs, increasing their damage done by 20%. If needed, you can soothe this buff. However, the mobs do take 10% increased damage while it's active, so if you can manage, do not remove it. Now that you've cleared the first trash area, you can hop on one of the 5 red drakes nearby and use their abilities to chip away at the mobs leading up to the first boss. I'd recommend using Engulfing Flames on the larger packs to deal as much damage as possible to them, and then just be sure to spam your Searing Ember in between. The first boss of the dungeon is General Umbriss. Throughout the fight, Umbriss will target players with Rock Spike. If targeted, spread from other players, press the defensive, and try and position towards the edge of the room, as you'll get knocked up and leave rumbling earth on the ground, which deals moderate physical damage and slows anybody caught within it. This is important as it affects Umbriss's second ability. When he casts Commanding Roar, he deals pretty substantial party-wide damage that can be mitigated with defensives, but also spawns 3 rows of Twilight Drakes that cast Shadow Flame Breath across the arena, which will one-shot anybody caught in their path. Be sure to move to the safe zone, and remember to keep an eye out for each new safe zone when Commanding Roar is cast, as it changes throughout the fight. Tanks will also have to keep an eye on the boss casting Skull Splitter on you, as this puts a nasty physical dot on you, followed by a stacking bleed. Be sure to use mitigation or call for externals if needed. Now that Umbriss has fallen, you can make your way towards the second boss of the dungeon, Forgemaster Throngus. Throngus will patrol around the room, so be careful not to pull him before clearing the trash. He will also cause pools of lava to spawn even before you pull him, so be sure to dodge these swirlies as you move around. You will want to clear the room for space before pulling him, and there are a few new mobs to deal with, so let's go over them now. Twilight Beguilers have 2 important casts to be aware of. Be sure to use spare kicks on Shadow Flame Bolt, as this deals large amounts of Shadow Flame damage to a random target. But your priority kick should be on their Seer Mind channel. This will stun a party member for 5 seconds while dealing shadow damage over time. If this is on your healer, you could be in big trouble. Beguilers also have a gimmick where they cast Beguile on nearby Molten Giants. This will stun them and increase their damage taken by 20%, so be sure to focus them down at this time. Molten Giants cast Molten Wake, which unleashes a wave of lava, dealing massive party-wide damage and increasing your fire damage taken by 20%. Be sure to use defenses for this, as you cannot stop it. Tanks should also use mitigation for their Lava Fist ability. This deals significant damage and can be nasty with the Molten Wake overlap. Twilight Flame Renders use a nasty tank buster called Shadow Flame Slash. Tanks should be prepared to mitigate this, as it deals massive amounts of Shadow Flame damage and also leaves a Shadow Flame dot. They also cast Blazing Shadow Flame, a randomly targeted frontal that all players should move out of, as it deals fatal Shadow Flame damage if anyone is struck. Now that you've cleared some room, it's time to take on the second boss of the dungeon. Throngus has 3 different abilities that he casts based on what weapon he's wielding at the time, and throughout the fight he will rotate between weapons, casting a unique ability before swapping and moving on to the next one. The first weapon he yields is a large axe, allowing him to cast Fiery Cleave. This is a large frontal cone that leaves a pool of lava on the floor, which lasts for 5 minutes. This is why clearing some space before pulling is important, as you'll eventually run out of room, and to maximize space you should try and bait this frontal into a wall. The boss will now cast Forge Weapon in order to cast his next ability. Use defensives and healing cooldowns here, as it deals substantial party-wide damage. Throngus is now wielding his swords, which allows him to cast Molten Flurry. Tanks should be prepared to use a defensive here, as it deals a lot of physical and fire damage over 6 seconds. During this channel, an ember will fly from Throngus' blades and afflict 3 players with Molten Spark. If you're hit, use a defensive and position yourself near a wall or near the pool left by Fiery Cleave, as you will drop molten spark pools on the floor, and these pools will deal massive damage and grow over time, so be sure to avoid them and manage your space as best as possible. After another Forged Weapons cast, Throngus will wield a Molten Mace that increases his melee damage by 1000% for 10 seconds. Tanks must kite away from the boss during this, as you will just get one shot even through cooldowns, but he will also leave a wake of molten lava as he runs, so again try and position near existing lava pools and play for space to the best of your ability. After taking down Throngus, we can head towards the third boss of the dungeon. Twilight Warlocks cast Enveloping Shadow Flame. This cannot be kicked and puts a massive heal absorb on players, whilst also dealing Shadow Flame damage every second for 16 seconds. A decurse is pretty much mandatory here, but if you don't have one, be sure to use personal defensives and healing cooldowns. You'll also want to kick their Shadow Flame Bolt, as it deals moderate Shadow Flame damage to a random target. Twilight Lava Benders have a large frontal ability, Shadow Lava Blast. Be sure to move out of the beam as it deals a lot of damage. At 50% HP, they will cast Ascension, dealing large amounts of Shadow Flame damage to anybody within 8 yards, so be sure to move out of melee, and when ascended, they will also emit Scorching Heat, dealing party-wide Shadow Flame damage until they are killed, so be sure to prioritize them down and use defensives. Finally, they cast Dark Eruption, causing Shadow Lava to erupt under your feet, dealing significant damage to anyone caught. The final mobs are Twilight Enforcers. Tanks need to be aware of their stacking Rampaging Rage buff, as they gain increased attack speed and eventually start dealing massive amounts of damage with their melees. Soothe this if possible, or kite if needed. In order to spawn the third boss of the encounter, you must take down Dragha Shadowburner first. Use any kicks on Shadow Flame Bolt, as this will blast a random player with moderate Shadow Flame damage. And if you have the means, decurse Curse of Entropy, as the curse deals shadow damage over time and absorbs healing equal to 40% of your HP for 20 seconds. When Dragha casts Invocation of Shadow Flame, he will create a portal that opens after 5 seconds, dealing a decent amount of fire damage and spawning an invoked Shadow Flame Spirit that will fixate on a player. You cannot let this ad reach you, as it will deal huge party-wide damage with Shadow Flame Nova and most likely cause a wipe. Swap to the ads and use any CC to slow or deter them from reaching you or party members, and make sure they die quickly. When Dragha flees, he will summon Valiona. Tanks should position her facing away from the group so people can avoid her devouring flame frontal. This deals massive shadow damage in a cone in front of her. Ads will continue to spawn from new portals summoned throughout the fight, so deal with them in the same way as before. And as the ad spawns, Valiona will flap her wings, casting Twilight Buffet, dealing a large amount of party-wide damage and knocking players back. Use personal defensives, healing cooldowns here, and also position yourself to get knocked away from the ads. Finally, be prepared to move out of the Twilight Winds that are spawned, as they deal substantial Shadow Flame damage and will slow you. On your way to the last boss of the dungeon, you'll encounter 2 new mobs. Mutated Hatchlings cast Shadow Corruption on death, which inflicts the party with Shadow Wounds, increasing shadow damage taken by 5% for 12 seconds. While these mobs don't do too much themselves, this Shadow Wound stacks and can be fatal when paired with the next mob, the Faceless Corruptor. Corruptors will channel Corrupt on a target, dealing insane amounts of shadow damage over 6 seconds. This ability deals a lot of damage even on its own, but if you kill lots of Hatchlings before it goes off, the targeted player will definitely die. Press defensives regardless for this ability and try not to overlap. Corruptors also cast Mind Piercer, summoning large shadowy pools on the floor that will mind control anyone caught in them. Be sure to sidestep out of these. Now we can tackle the last boss, Erudax. Early on and every 45 seconds after, the boss will unleash party-wide damage over the course of his Void Surge channel. You'll want to use defensives here. This channel will also spawn many Void Tendrils around the encounter that players will need to continue to dodge for the rest of the fight. Stepping in one of these will stun the target for 4 seconds and deal heavy damage. Just after this channel, the boss will then cast Shadow Gale, closing in the room with Void to a random location that your whole party will need to move to. Once you reach the small safe spot, the boss will then afflict 3 players with Abyssal Corruption, which deals ticking damage to all players within 6 yards of the targeted players, so try and spread in the small space you have here, and use a defensive to mitigate the damage. Once the room opens back up, Erudax will cast Void Infusion that will corrupt nearby eggs and spawn mutated hatchlings. Tanks must be quick to pick up aggro on these, and DPS should nuke them down, but again, these hatchlings will apply a shadow wound that increases the shadow damage taken, so prepare with defensives for after if needed. Finally, tanks will need to deal with the boss's Crush. This deals heavy physical and shadow damage to the tank and knocks them back. Tanks you'll need to make sure to not get knocked back into the tendrils during this time. But that's it for this boss, and that wraps up Grim Batol for Mythic Plus in Season 1. If you're interested in my nameplates, they are from my free plates profile, which can be found inside my Discord. The link will be in the description. And if this guide did help you or a friend out, then please feel free to drop a like down below, subscribe to your boy, and until next time, I'll catch you guys later.